Chapter 1. The Invitation to Larkspur Hollow. The train to Larkspur Hollow ran only twice a day, and Miss Marple had always thought there was something faintly conspiratorial about a place that discouraged easy arrival. She sat by the window with her gloved hands folded over the clasp of her handbag, watching the Kent countryside dissolve into a soft, persistent drizzle, the hedgerows blurring to green smudges as the little train wound its way past fields gone silver with wet light. It was the sort of September afternoon that seemed to hold its breath, not quite autumn, not quite the last exhalation of summer, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago to distrust weather that could not decide what it wanted to be, found herself unaccountably alert. She was travelling, ostensibly, to visit her old school friend, Dorothy Fenwick, a widow who had settled in the village some years before and whose letters had lately taken on a curious tone. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of careful omission, as though Dorothy were choosing her words the way one steps around a puddle one does not wish to acknowledge. "You must come and see the old place," she had written. "Things have grown so strange here, though I could not say precisely how." It was not the sort of sentence one could ignore, and Miss Marple, who had built a lifetime's quiet reputation on noticing what others chose not to say, had packed her bags within the week. Larkspur Hollow revealed itself slowly, the way old villages do. First the church spire above the trees, grey and patient, then the cluster of thatched roofs huddled around a green gone brown at the edges from lack of rain, until this week's sudden downpour, and finally the high brick wall that ran along the eastern road, ivy-choked and crumbling in places, behind which, Dorothy had told her in an earlier letter, stood Thornfield Manor. The village itself seemed pleasant enough at first glance, a war memorial dusted with fallen leaves, a post office with its blinds half drawn, a public house called the Fox and Feathers, from whose windows came the low murmur of afternoon drinkers. But Miss Marple had spent enough decades in villages very like this one to know that pleasantness was often the thinnest of veneers, and that beneath the ordinary rhythms of a place, the baker's cart, the vicar's bicycle, the women gossiping outside the greengrocer's, there frequently ran a current of something else entirely. Old grievances, nursed like embers, resentments passed down like family silver, secrets kept not out of malice, but out of the simple, exhausting habit of survival. Dorothy met her at the station, her umbrella dripping, her face doing that particular thing faces do when they are trying very hard to appear untroubled. Over tea, in Dorothy's low-beamed sitting room, with the fire smoking faintly and rain ticking against the window panes, the conversation turned, as it always did in villages, to a name. "Edmund Rayburn," Dorothy said, setting down her cup with more care than the gesture required. "You'll hear it before the day's out. I shouldn't wonder. Everyone has an opinion of him, and none of them kind." She described him in the clipped, careful language people use for someone they dislike but feel obscurely guilty about disliking. A recluse, a miser, a man who had let the manor's tenant cottages fall to ruin rather than spend a shilling on repairs, who had quarrelled publicly with his nephew over money not a fortnight past, who kept to his conservatory each evening with his orchids and his whiskey, and no company at all. "They say he isn't even truly a Rayburn by temperament," Dorothy added, almost to herself, staring into the fire. "Though, of course, he's the last of them. There's no one left to say otherwise." It was a curious phrase, and Miss Marple filed it away, the way she filed most curious phrases, not as evidence of anything, but simply as a small stone dropped into the still pool of her attention, its ripples worth watching. Later, as the rain eased and Dorothy suggested a short walk before supper, they passed along the eastern road beneath the ivy-strangled wall of Thornfield Manor, its wrought-iron gates just visible through the mist. And it was there, in the deepening grey of early evening, that Miss Marple heard it. Two voices, low and urgent, coming from just beyond the gates, where the shadow of an ancient yew fell across the gravel drive. A man's voice, tight with something between pleading and fury, and a woman's, quieter, more controlled, cutting through his with the calm precision of someone long practiced in restraint. She could not make out the words. She caught only fragments. "You don't understand what you're asking." And then silence, so sudden and complete that it seemed almost deliberate, as though both speakers had become aware, in the same instant, that the evening had ears. Dorothy, walking on ahead, had noticed nothing at all. Miss Marple paused at the gate a moment longer than was necessary, her pale eyes moving thoughtfully over the darkened windows of the great house rising beyond the trees, and felt, quite distinctly, the small, cold certainty that something in Larkspur Hollow was very wrong indeed. Chapter 2. The Man in the Conservatory. Dorothy insisted, over Miss Marple's mild protestations, that they call at the manor the following morning. A courtesy visit, she explained, since Miss Marple's presence in the village would soon become common knowledge, and it would look odder still not to pay respects to so prominent, if unloved, a neighbour. Miss Marple, who suspected that Dorothy's real motive was curiosity dressed as decorum, accepted with the placid good humour of a woman who has long since stopped pretending that villages run on anything but gossip, and the two of them set off after breakfast beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Thornfield Manor, seen at close quarters in the flat morning light, possessed the particular melancholy of a house that had once been loved and was no longer. The lawns, though cut, had been cut carelessly. The flower beds nearest the drive had gone to seed, and the conservatory, a great glass house of Victorian iron and glass jutting from the western wing like some elaborate afterthought, was the only part of the grounds that showed any sign of devoted attention. Its panes gleaming, its interior a riot of orchids visible even from the drive, purple and white and improbably alive against the grey morning. It was Prudence Allerton who admitted them, and Miss Marple's first impression of the housekeeper was one of such complete unremarkableness that she found herself, with the instinct of long habit, looking twice. Prudence was perhaps 50, grey-haired, neatly dressed in dark wool, with the kind of face that seemed designed to be forgotten the moment one looked away from it. Pleasant, composed, utterly without ornament. She moved through the hall with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent decades making herself useful and invisible in equal measure, and when she spoke, informing them, in a voice pitched precisely between warmth and deference, that Mr. Raeburn was in his study and might receive them shortly, there was nothing in her manner that Miss Marple could have named as wrong. And yet something in the woman's stillness, the particular quality of her calm, struck Miss Marple as the calm not of contentment, but of long, careful practice. The stillness of a hand held steady over many years against some private trembling. Edmund Raeburn received them at last, in a study smelling of pipe tobacco and old leather. A tall man gone stooped with age, his face deeply lined, his eyes pale and watchful beneath heavy brows. He was courteous in the manner of a man performing courtesy rather than feeling it, his conversation clipped and impatient, his gaze sliding frequently toward the window, as though some part of him were already elsewhere. He spoke of his orchids with more animation than he had spoken of anything else, a sudden, startling warmth breaking through the crust of his reserve when Dorothy asked, more from politeness than interest, about the conservatory. 9 o'clock, he said, almost to himself, tapping his pipe against the ashtray. I go to them at 9 each evening, without fail. They require attention, regularity. He looked up then, and for a moment his pale eyes rested on Miss Marple with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the mildness of her presence, as though he were trying to place her, or perhaps trying to determine what she had already noticed. Most people, he added, cannot be trusted with regularity. They let things slip. They let things change. There was something beneath the words that Miss Marple could not quite name, a current of unease disguised as horticultural philosophy, and she found herself thinking, not for the first time in her life, that men who spoke passionately of order were very often men most afraid of what lay beneath it. The visit was cut short by the arrival of Gerald Raeburn, the nephew, a handsome, restless young man in his 30s, whose entrance brought with it an immediate chill. He greeted his uncle with a brittle cheerfulness that fooled no one, and the two men exchanged a look, brief, charged, quickly suppressed, that spoke of some argument recently concluded and by no means resolved. Gerald's eyes were shadowed, his hands not quite steady as he reached for the sherry decanter on the sideboard without being offered any. And when Dorothy inquired pleasantly after his plans, he answered too quickly, too brightly, in the manner of a man reciting lines he had rehearsed against just such a question. They took their leave shortly after, passing in the hall a young maid, Lucy Fenwick, Dorothy murmured once they were outside, recently dismissed, though she still lingered about the grounds on some pretext or other, whose eyes, when they met Miss Marple's for the briefest of moments, held something raw and unguarded that vanished the instant she realized she was observed. Grief, Miss Marple thought, or something very near it. Not the practiced sorrow of a servant let go, but the particular devastation of a woman who has lost something she never had the right to claim. It was past 10 that evening, with Dorothy already retired and Miss Marple sitting by her bedroom window watching the last light fail over the wet fields, that the church bells began their frantic, uneven tolling. Not the measured peal of Sunday service, but something urgent and wrong, the kind of ringing that pulls a village from its beds. Miss Marple was dressed and downstairs within minutes, moving with a swiftness that belied her years, and found the lane already filling with lanterns and hurrying figures, all converging on the gates of Thornfield Manor. Inside, the great house had come alive with a terrible, disordered energy. Servants weeping in doorways, Gerald Rayburn standing frozen and grey-faced in the hall, a housemaid being half carried, half supported by the cook, her sobs echoing up the staircase. And through the open door of the conservatory, where the orchid stood serene and unmoved beneath the glass roof, Miss Marple saw him. Edmund Rayburn lay among his beloved flowers, one arm flung out across the tiled floor, the garden shears buried deep in his chest, dark blood pooling black in the lamplight against the white petals scattered around him. His face, in death, wore an expression Miss Marple would remember for a long time afterward. Not fear, not pain, but something closer to astonishment, as though in his final moment he had seen something he had spent 30 years refusing to look at. And somewhere behind her, cutting through the general clamour of the household's grief, came a single scream, sharp, involuntary, instantly stifled, from a voice Miss Marple recognized at once as belonging to the quiet, composed, utterly unremarkable Prudence Allerton. Chapter 3. A Room Locked from Within. The local police arrived within the half-hour in the person of Inspector Thomas Bell, a heavy-set, unhurried man whose manner suggested he had long ago decided that Larkspur Hollow's excitements were seldom as complicated as they first appeared. He moved through the conservatory with the brisk efficiency of a man eager to conclude an unpleasant business before it interfered with his supper, and Miss Marple, standing quietly by the glass doors with her hands folded before her, watched him work with the particular patience of a woman who had seen a great many capable men arrive at convenient conclusions. "Door was locked from the inside," Bell announced, more to the room at large than to anyone in particular, holding up the small brass key he had extracted from the dead man's waistcoat pocket. "Windows painted shut years ago, by the look of them. Old habit of his, kept the damp out for the orchids. No way in, no way out, save the one door, and the key was on his person." He turned the key over in his thick fingers as though its very solidity settled the matter. Man goes to tend his flowers of an evening, has a fall, shears go into him wrong. Accident most like. Or, he glanced, not unkindly, toward the huddled figure of Gerald Rayburn, who sat white-faced on the drawing-room sofa with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. Something sadder. He wasn't a happy man by all accounts. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a solution of admirable simplicity. And simplicity was precisely what made her uneasy. She had learned, across a long lifetime of watching human affairs unfold in villages very like this one, that the world's true tragedies were rarely so obliging as to arrange themselves into tidy accidents, and that the moment an explanation felt convenient, it generally deserved a second look. She asked, with the vague apologetic diffidence of an elderly woman who feared she might be a nuisance, whether she might simply sit a moment in the corner while the gentlemen concluded their business. She had, she explained, come over quite faint at the sight of poor Mr. Rayburn, and the drawing-room felt rather far to walk just at present. Bell, distracted and not unsympathetic, waved his permission and returned to his notes, and Miss Marple settled herself in a wicker chair near the conservatory doors, from which vantage point, quite unnoticed, as elderly women so often are, she could observe everything. The first wrongness presented itself almost at once. Edmund Rayburn's hands, lying loose upon the tiles, were bare, but a pair of stout gardening gloves lay discarded near the overturned plant stand some distance from the body, and Miss Marple, whose eye for such domestic particulars had been sharpened by decades of village fêtes and flower shows, noted that the gloves were a size that would have swallowed the dead man's long, narrow fingers entirely. A man who tended orchids with the devotion Edmund Rayburn had shown would surely own gloves fitted precisely to his own hand, and yet these were broader, thicker, plainly meant for someone of heavier build. She said nothing, but filed the observation away with the others. The second wrongness was the watch. It had fallen, or been knocked, from the dead man's waistcoat and lay half-hidden beneath a fallen orchid leaf. Its face cracked, its hands stopped at 17 minutes past 9. And yet Bell had already established, through questioning the shaken cook, that the household had heard Rayburn moving about the conservatory as late as 9:30, the particular scrape of his chair against the tiles being a sound so familiar to the servants that its absence, rather than its presence, would have been remarkable. A watch stopped by a fatal blow should surely mark the moment of death, not some quarter hour before it, unless the watch had stopped for some other reason entirely, dropped, perhaps, in an earlier struggle, and its testimony discarded by whoever had left it there. It was the third detail, however, that troubled Miss Marple most, precisely because it was the smallest. Passing near the kitchen on her way to find Dorothy, she paused, as elderly women pause, seemingly without purpose, at doorways and windows, and observed the kitchen maid washing a single china teacup at the sink, her hands moving with the particular haste of someone anxious to have a task finished before it could be questioned. "That's Mr. Rayburn's cup, isn't it?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly, as though remarking on the weather. "From this evening." The maid, a girl of perhaps 16 with round, frightened eyes, nodded before she seemed to think better of it. "Miss Allerton said to wash it up directly, ma'am. Said it oughtn't sit dirty in a house of mourning." It was, on its surface, a perfectly reasonable instruction, and yet Miss Marple knew, from a lifetime's careful attention to the small tyrannies and rhythms of English domestic service, that no well-run household washed its crockery before the morning's proper order, least of all on a night when the police were still in the house, and every object within it might yet prove of consequence. A good housekeeper knew this instinctively. It was, in fact, precisely the sort of thing a good housekeeper would never do, unless she had some particular reason to want a cup, and whatever it had contained, gone from the world as quickly as possible. Miss Marple thanked the girl and moved on, her expression giving away nothing of the quiet, cold clarity that had begun to settle over her thoughts. It was as she passed the study, its door left ajar in the general disorder of the evening, that she noticed the fire had been lit and allowed to burn low, its embers still faintly glowing, though the room stood empty, and among the ashes in the grate, not yet fully consumed, lay the curling black remnant of what had once been a letter. She glanced once down the empty corridor behind her, and then, with the swift, economical movement of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated, she reached into the grate and drew out the fragment before the fire could finish what it had begun. It was scorched badly at both edges, the ink faded and smeared by heat, but 3 words remained legible upon it, written in a hand she did not recognize, and they were words that would not leave her thoughts for the remainder of that long and troubled night. The Allerton Boy. Chapter 4. Whispers below stairs. Sleep, when it came to her at all that night, was thin and unsatisfying, and Miss Marple rose the next morning with the scorched fragment of paper still folded carefully into the lining of her handbag, its 3 words turning over and over in her thoughts like a stone worried smooth by a stream. The Allerton boy. It was not, she reflected over a solitary breakfast of tea and toast, Dorothy having taken to her bed with the nervous headache that so often follows proximity to sudden death, a phrase that belonged naturally to a household such as Thornfield's. Allerton was not a name she had heard spoken by anyone in the village, and yet it sat now beside another name entirely too close for comfort. Prudence Allerton, whose scream in the conservatory had been, Miss Marple was quite certain, not the scream of a woman confronting an employer's misfortune, but something very much more personal. She returned to the manor that afternoon under the entirely reasonable pretext of inquiring after the household's welfare, a kindness any decent neighbour might extend, and one which had the further advantage of placing her, teacup in hand, in the servants' sitting-room, where grief and gossip mingled with the particular freedom that only the kitchen quarters of a great house could provide. It was there that she began, with the gentle, unthreatening persistence of an elderly lady who seemed to want nothing more than company, to draw the household staff into conversation. The cook, a stout, red-faced woman named Mrs. Pargeter, proved voluble on the subject of Miss Allerton's virtues. 20 years of devoted service, never a cross word, never so much as a day's illness taken. A woman who had nursed the old cook's predecessor through her final months without complaint, and who had, more than once, quietly settled a servant's debt from her own thin wages, rather than see the household embarrassed. A saint, that woman, Mrs. Pargeter pronounced, with the flat certainty of someone who had never once questioned the description. Devoted to the master she was, whatever else folk might say of him. And yet it was precisely this, the unblemished, unremarkable perfection of Prudence Allerton's 20 years, that struck Miss Marple as worth a second and third examination. In her long experience of English households, devotion of such unwavering completeness was rare enough to be remarkable in itself, and Miss Marple had learned, through the accumulated evidence of many small village tragedies, that the most perfectly composed surfaces frequently concealed the most turbulent depths, that a woman who never spoke a cross word might simply be a woman who had trained herself, through long and painful practice, never to let a cross word escape. "And has Miss Allerton always been with the family?" she asked, stirring her tea with the vague, unhurried air of idle curiosity. 20 years is a very long time to remain in one place. Mrs. Pargeter considered this with the slow deliberation of someone unused to being asked to think, rather than simply to speak. "Come to us not long after old Mr. Rayburn passed, the elder one, that is, Edmund's uncle. Miss Allerton arrived with excellent references, though I couldn't say from where exactly. Kept herself to herself about her family, always did. Never spoke of them, not once in all these years, though I did hear," and here the cook lowered her voice, glancing toward the door with the instinctive caution of servants everywhere. "I did hear, years back, mind, that she'd had a brother once, died young, somewhere abroad. She wears black on a certain day each year, though she's never said why, and God help the girl who asks her about it." It was a small thing, offered almost carelessly, and yet Miss Marple felt the quiet, deliberate click of a lock turning somewhere in the architecture of the mystery. The sensation, familiar to her from a dozen village puzzles before this one, of a single loose thread, beginning, very gently, to unravel a much larger garment. The conversation turned, as such conversations inevitably did, to Gerald Rayburn, and here Mrs. Pargeter grew considerably less charitable. The nephew, it seemed, had been a frequent and unwelcome visitor these past months, his demands for money growing more insistent with each visit, his temper more frayed. There had been a scene, not a fortnight past, audible from the kitchen despite the thickness of the study door, Gerald's voice raised in something close to desperation, the older man's response cold and immovable. Told him flat he'd not see another penny till the will was settled proper, Mrs. Pargeter said, with the satisfaction of one repeating a piece of gossip she had long been eager to share. And Mr. Gerald white as a sheet when he came out, though whether from fright or fury I couldn't say. Miss Marple thanked the cook for her hospitality and rose to take her leave, pausing in the narrow servants' passage that led back toward the main hall, where the light fell dim and grey through a single high window. It was there that a voice, low, hesitant, belonging to a young footman she had not yet been introduced to, stopped her with a hand half raised, as though its owner had debated the wisdom of speaking and lost. "You're the lady staying with Mrs. Fenwick," he said. And when Miss Marple confirmed this with a mild nod, he glanced once down the passage behind him before continuing, his voice dropping further still. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, ma'am, only you seem the sort as listens." He hesitated again, twisting his cap between his hands. "This house remembers things longer than people do, if you take my meaning. There's them in this house been keeping quiet a good deal longer than 20 years, and I'll say no more than that. Only—" his eyes flicked, involuntarily, toward the green baize door that led down to the housekeeper's private sitting room, its brass handle gleaming faintly in the shadowed passage. "Only you might ask yourself why a woman who never once raised her voice in 20 years was heard, not 3 months back, weeping behind that very door, alone, in the middle of the night, when she thought the whole house was fast asleep." Chapter 5. The Nephew's Debts. Gerald Rayburn had taken rooms at the Fox and Feathers, rather than remain beneath his uncle's roof a moment longer than propriety required. And it was there, in a low-ceilinged private parlour smelling faintly of stale ale and wood smoke, that Miss Marple found him the following afternoon, ostensibly delivering a note of condolence from Dorothy that might, in truth, have been sent by the twopenny post. She had learned long ago that young men in trouble were seldom so guarded with an elderly stranger as they were with those who might carry tales back to people who mattered to them. And Gerald, when she was shown in, seemed almost relieved to find his visitor was not the inspector he had plainly been dreading. He was, she thought, watching him rise unsteadily to offer her the room's better chair, a young man whose handsomeness had begun to curdle into something more haggard. The fine bones of his face, sharpened by what she suspected was less grief than a more immediate and gnawing anxiety. His eyes rimmed with the particular redness of a man who has not slept, and has instead spent the night's dark hours in the company of a bottle. He spoke first of his uncle in the practised tones of bereavement, a hard man, but family nonetheless, a tragedy however one looked at it, and Miss Marple listened with the mild, encouraging attentiveness that so often persuaded troubled young men to say a great deal more than they had intended. "You had debts, I understand," she said at last, gently, when the performance of grief had exhausted itself and left only the raw thing beneath. "Forgive an old woman's bluntness, Mr. Rayburn, but villagers talk, and I find it generally kinder to ask a question plainly than to let it fester unasked." Something in Gerald seemed to give way at that, the careful composure cracking like ice too thin for the weight upon it. "Yes," he admitted, his voice dropping, "there had been debts, gambling debts, incurred in London among a set of friends whose company he now bitterly regretted keeping, sums that had grown with the particular cruelty of compound interest until they threatened not merely his comfort but his liberty. He had gone to his uncle 3 times in as many months, and 3 times been refused with a coldness that had left him, he confessed, hating the old man with an intensity that frightened him even now. "He said I'd inherit nothing but a lesson in economy," Gerald said, staring into the dead fire. "Said the estate would go to charity before it went to a fool who couldn't keep his own accounts. I told him, God forgive me, I told him he'd be better off dead, and meant it, in the moment, the way a man means a great many things he doesn't truly mean at all." Miss Marple observed him with the particular clarity she reserved for moments such as this. Not the clarity of suspicion exactly, but of careful measurement, weighing the man before her against the shape of the crime itself. There was fear in Gerald Rayburn, certainly, and guilt enough to choke on, but it was, she thought, the fear of a coward caught in circumstances of his own making, rather than the fear of a man concealing violence. Guilt of association was so easily mistaken, by the unpracticed eye, for guilt of action, and Miss Marple had seen too many young men convicted in the court of village opinion for the crime of simply being present when misfortune struck. "You were at the manor that evening," she said. It was not quite a question. Gerald's hands, wrapped around his untouched glass, went very still. "I was," he admitted, after a long moment. "I'd gone to try him once more, a last appeal, though I knew well enough how it would end. He wouldn't see me. Told Prudence, Miss Allerton, to send me away, and she did, though not unkindly. I left by the side path, the one that runs along the conservatory wall, meaning to go straight back to the village." He stopped. "And did you?" Miss Marple asked, very gently. The silence that followed stretched long enough that she began to think he would not answer at all, and when he did, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, as though the words themselves frightened him more than anything the inspector might do with them. "I saw someone," he said, "by the conservatory door. It was near dark, and I didn't stop. Didn't want to be seen there myself, God knows, given how things stood between my uncle and me. But I saw a figure, just for a moment, standing quite still at the glass, looking in. His eyes came up to meet hers, wide and stricken. I've thought of nothing else since. I keep telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, my own guilty conscience giving me phantoms. But it wasn't nothing, was it? Someone was there, before whatever happened happened." "Who was it, Mr. Rayburn?" He shook his head, and there was something in the gesture, not defiance, but a kind of desperate self-preservation that told Miss Marple he had already decided, in the sleepless hours of the previous night, exactly how far he was prepared to go. "I couldn't say for certain. It was dark, and I was some distance off, and I've no wish to hang an innocent person on the strength of a shadow I barely saw." He set down his glass with a hand that shook visibly now. "But I'll tell you this much, and no more, because I think you're a woman who notices things others don't." He leaned forward, his voice dropping until it was scarcely more than breath. "Whoever it was standing at that door wasn't wearing outdoor clothes, no coat, no hat, nothing against the evening chill, as though they'd stepped out from somewhere close by, somewhere inside the house itself, and meant to step straight back in again before anyone noticed they'd gone at all." Chapter 6. The Doctor's Silence. Dr. Instow received Miss Marple in his surgery 2 days later, a low stone building adjoining his cottage at the far end of the village, its waiting rooms smelling of carbolic, and the particular staleness of rooms where anxious people sit too long with their fears. He was a tall, spare man of perhaps 45, with the deliberate, unhurried manner cultivated by physicians who have learned to make waiting seem like care rather than delay, and he greeted his unexpected visitor with the wary courtesy of a man who suspected, correctly as it happened, that her call had rather less to do with her health than with his own recent movements. She had come, she explained, feeling the need of a tonic after the shock of poor Mr. Rayburn's death, an excuse thin enough that she saw, in the brief flicker of his expression, that he recognized it for what it was, and chose, out of some professional courtesy or private calculation, not to challenge it. He took her pulse with unnecessary solemnity, prescribed a mild sedative she had no intention of taking, and it was only as he was writing out the prescription, his pen scratching softly in the quiet room, that Miss Marple remarked, with the vague and apparently harmless curiosity of the elderly, that it must have been a difficult evening for him too, called out to the manor at such an hour. The pen stopped. It was a small thing, the merest hesitation, a fraction of a second in which the nib hovered above the paper, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime cataloguing such fractions, and she watched Dr. Instow recover himself with the visible effort of a man drawing a curtain hastily across a lit window. "I wasn't called to the manor that evening," he said, a shade too evenly. "I understand Mr. Rayburn was already beyond help by the time anyone thought to send for me." "Forgive me," Miss Marple said, with every appearance of contrition. "I had understood from the servants that you'd called earlier, before the dreadful business, I mean. Perhaps I misheard." He did not correct her, which was, she thought, its own small answer. Instead, he busied himself with his instruments, and it was only as she was preparing to take her leave that he said, with the studied casualness of a man who has decided that silence would be more conspicuous than a partial truth, "I did call at the manor that afternoon, as it happens. A private matter, nothing to do with Mr. Rayburn's health. I'd rather it didn't become fodder for the village, if it's all the same to you." She did not press him. Pressing, in her experience, so rarely yielded truth, whereas patience so frequently did. But she left the surgery with the settled conviction that whatever had taken Dr. Instow to Thornfield Manor that afternoon, it had concerned not the master of the house, but someone within it, and the rumour Dorothy had mentioned in passing of an old and never quite substantiated attachment between the doctor and the manor's housekeeper returned to her now with considerably more weight than village gossip generally deserved. It was this thought that carried her, that same afternoon, back through the manor's gates on the pretext of returning a shawl Dorothy had left behind during their first visit. A pretext so flimsy, she rather suspected the butler saw through it entirely, though he admitted her all the same, the household by now grown accustomed to her quiet, persistent presence among them. She found Prudence Allerton in the small sitting room set aside for the housekeeper's private use, seated at a writing desk with an unfinished letter before her, and it was here that Miss Marple observed, for the first time at close quarters and without the mediating presence of others, the full and careful architecture of the woman's composure. Prudence rose to greet her with perfect civility, offered tea that Miss Marple gently declined, answered every question about the household's arrangements with the same measured, unhurried precision, and yet beneath it, Miss Marple sensed something held so tightly in check that it seemed, at moments, almost to hum, like a wire drawn taut enough to sing if only one knew where to touch it. Her hands, folded in her lap, were perfectly still, but her eyes, when they rested for a moment too long on the framed photograph of Edmund Rayburn that stood upon the mantel, held an expression Miss Marple could only have described as grief wearing the mask of duty. It was as she was leaving, having lingered rather longer than the shawl's return strictly required, that Miss Marple's eye, trained by decades of noticing the small disorders that human beings, however careful, invariably leave behind them, fell upon the lowest drawer of a mahogany bureau standing against the far wall. It had been pushed shut, but not quite flush with its neighbours, as though someone in recent haste had failed to close it fully, and protruding from the narrow gap was the corner of something pale and stiff. Not paper, she thought, but something older, something that had been folded and unfolded many times across many years. She waited until Prudence had stepped briefly from the room to answer a servant's summons, and then, with the swift and practiced discretion of a woman who had long ago learned that opportunities of this kind seldom announce themselves twice, she crossed the room and eased the drawer open. Inside, beneath a small collection of letters tied with faded ribbon, lay an old photograph, its edges soft with handling, its surface silvered with age. It showed a young man of perhaps 20, standing before what appeared to be a country church, his features sharp and unformed with youth, and there, unmistakable even in the photograph's faded grain, ran a pale, jagged scar along the line of his jaw, from ear to chin, the mark of some old and violent injury. Miss Marple stood very still, the photograph trembling faintly in her gloved hand, for she had seen, not 3 days before, the face of Edmund Rayburn laid out cold upon the conservatory floor, and that face, unlined by youth but otherwise entirely unmistakable in its bone and structure, had borne no scar at all. Chapter 7. The Face in the Photograph. She returned the photograph to its drawer before Prudence came back into the room, her outward manner betraying nothing of the quiet upheaval taking place beneath it. And it was not until she was safely back in the lane beyond the manor gates, the grey afternoon closing in around her, that Miss Marple permitted herself to stop walking and simply stand a moment with the enormity of what she had seen settling slowly into place, like sediment finding the bottom of still water. A scar, unmistakable and old, upon a face that could not have been more than 25 years distant from the man she had seen dead upon the conservatory floor. A face that was, in every particular save that single vivid detail, the face of Edmund Rayburn as a young man. And yet Edmund Rayburn's face, in death as she had observed it, and as she recalled it now from their brief meeting in his study, had been entirely unmarked, the jaw smooth and unbroken from ear to chin, without so much as the faintest trace of old injury. It was, she told herself, walking on slowly now with her mind moving considerably faster than her feet, precisely the sort of detail that might mean nothing at all. Scars fade with time, certainly, though rarely so completely as to vanish without trace, and photographs deceive as often as they reveal. And yet the phrase from the burnt letter returned to her now with fresh and troubling force. The Allerton boy, set beside a photograph, kept hidden in a locked drawer by a woman who wore black each year on a day she would not explain. A woman whose composure cracked, alone and unwitnessed, behind a closed door in the small hours of the night. She spent that evening, and a portion of the next morning, in Dorothy's small but well-stocked library, where several decades' worth of county directories and parish records sat gathering dust upon shelves that Dorothy's late husband, a man of antiquarian inclinations, had assembled with more enthusiasm than organization. It was tedious work, and slow, the particular tedium of tracing a family's fortunes through the dry, unforgiving language of wills and parish registers, but Miss Marple had never been a woman to shrink from tedium when it stood between herself and the truth, and by the time the church clock struck noon, she had assembled, from fragments scattered across 6 sources, a history considerably stranger than the one the village told itself. The Rayburns of Thornfield Manor, it emerged, had numbered 2 sons in the generation before Edmund's own inheritance. The elder, also named Edmund, heir to the estate by right of birth, and a younger brother who had died in infancy, leaving the elder son as sole heir apparent. This elder Edmund had, according to a brief and rather bloodless notice in an old county paper, spent several years abroad in his youth, Italy, then later India, pursuing, the notice suggested with the vague delicacy such notices reserved for family embarrassments, interests of a personal nature, before returning to England to claim his inheritance upon his uncle's death, some 30 years past. It was this return and this inheritance that the village had always understood to mark the beginning of the Edmund Rayburn they had known, reclusive, changed, hardened by his years abroad into the cold and guarded man he had remained ever since. But it was a smaller notice, tucked into the same paper some months earlier, that arrested Miss Marple's attention entirely and held it fast. A brief item, easily overlooked, reporting the death abroad, in circumstances the notice described only as sudden and much regretted, of a young Englishman travelling under the name of Edmund Rayburn, in a small town outside Florence, some 8 months before the heir's celebrated return to claim Thornfield Manor. The notice gave no further detail, offered no explanation for the curious redundancy of 2 reports so closely spaced concerning the same name, and Miss Marple sat for a long while with the yellowed newsprint before her, feeling the cold, careful architecture of a decades-old deception beginning to reveal itself, piece by piece, like a house glimpsed through slowly clearing fog. A young man had died abroad, under a name that was not perhaps entirely his own to claim, and some months later, a man calling himself by that same name, a man whose face, if the hidden photograph spoke true, had once borne a scar that vanished, unaccountably, somewhere upon the long road home from Italy, had returned to England to claim an inheritance that a scarred young man, and not this smooth-jawed stranger, ought properly to have received. She thought of Edmund Rayburn as she had known him in life, his guardedness, his obsessive devotion to a single room within his own house, the strange, startled anguish frozen upon his face in death, as though in his final moment he had confronted something he had spent 30 years refusing to see. She thought of Prudence Allerton's perfect, practiced composure and the grief that lived beneath it like water beneath ice. And she thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with the grey autumn air pressing against Dorothy's library windows, of the burnt fragment of letter still folded in her handbag, and the name it bore, the Allerton boy, a name that belonged. She now suspected with a certainty that made her old heart ache, not to some servant's forgotten relation, but to the true and rightful Edmund Raeburn, whose death abroad 30 years past had been recorded, briefly and without fanfare, in a newspaper column that all of Larkspur Hollow had long since forgotten to read. The man who had lain dead among his orchids, she understood now with a clarity that left her sitting very still in the hushed library, had never been Edmund Raeburn at all. And whoever he truly was, he had spent 30 years wearing a dead man's name as carefully and as fearfully as another wore a mask that had finally, on one dark September evening, been torn away. Chapter 8. The Allerton Name. There remained, Miss Marple reflected, as she closed the last of Dorothy's dusty county directories, one thread still to be drawn taut before the whole pattern could be trusted to hold. The name itself, Allerton, which had surfaced first as ash in a dying grate and now sat lodged in her thoughts beside a photograph of a scarred young man before a country church. A name so ordinary it might have belonged to any of 1,000 English families, and yet one which, set against the housekeeper's unblemished 20 years of service and her unexplained grief, seemed to Miss Marple to hum with the particular resonance of a struck bell whose sound has not quite finished travelling. She found what she needed, in the end, not in Dorothy's library, but in the vestry of the parish church itself, where the elderly verger, a garrulous man named Hobbs, delighted by any interruption to the tedium of his afternoon, proved only too willing to fetch down the older registers at her request, murmuring something about a family history she claimed, with only the smallest prick of conscience, to be researching for a friend. It was slow work, turning brittle pages by the grey light through the vestry window, but persistence had always been, in Miss Marple's long experience, considerably more valuable to the solving of mysteries than brilliance, and it was persistence alone that led her, some 40 minutes later, to an entry some 35 years old, recording the birth of one Prudence Mary Allerton, daughter of a Thomas Allerton, described in the register's spare hand as a gentleman farmer of the parish of Whitcomb St. Giles, and, entered upon the very same page, not 18 months earlier, the birth of a brother, christened Edmund Thomas Allerton. Miss Marple sat very still in the cold vestry, the register open before her, and felt the last piece of the pattern settle into place with the quiet, terrible finality of a door closing somewhere out of sight. An inquiry to Mr. Hobbs, phrased with the careful indirection she had long since perfected, yielded the remainder of the history in the halting, half-remembered fashion of village recollection. The Allertons of Whitcomb St. Giles, it seemed, had once been a family of some standing, connected, Hobbs believed, though the details had grown hazy with the passage of years, to the Raeburns themselves through some tangle of cousinship 2 generations back, close enough that the young Edmund Allerton had been raised alongside his Raeburn cousins, and had, upon the death of the old squire's direct heirs, stood next in line to inherit Thornfield itself, had not the estate passed instead, through some legal contrivance Hobbs could not clearly recall, to a more distant branch of the family entirely. Ruined them, that business did, Hobbs said, shaking his head with the vague sorrow of a man discussing a tragedy too old to feel keenly. Old Allerton took it hard, lost the farm not long after, and the family scattered. Sad business, though what became of the son and daughter after that, I couldn't rightly say. Miss Marple could say, now, with a certainty that left her feeling not triumphant, but profoundly and unexpectedly sorrowful. The son had gone abroad, to Italy, to seek whatever fortune or reconciliation a disinherited young man might seek in foreign travel, and had died there, quietly and without fanfare, some 8 months before a stranger returned to England wearing his name, his inheritance, and, if the burnt letter and the years of silence were any indication, the terrible unspoken knowledge of what had truly happened to him. And the daughter, Prudence, had grown to womanhood in the wreckage of her family's ruin, and had come, 20 years past, not as a stranger seeking employment, but as a woman who had recognized, in the scarless face of the man calling himself Edmund Raeburn, something that no one else in Larkspur Hollow had thought to question. It was late afternoon, the light already failing toward evening, when Miss Marple returned once more to the manor, and this time she did not trouble herself with pretexts. She found Prudence in the small sitting room where she had discovered the photograph, seated once again at the writing desk, and something in the housekeeper's stillness as Miss Marple entered, a stillness too complete, too braced, told her that Prudence had been expecting this visit, perhaps for longer than either of them cared to admit. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself without invitation into the chair opposite, "that you knew Edmund Raeburn a very long time before you came into his service, longer perhaps than anyone in this house has ever supposed." For a long moment Prudence said nothing at all, her hands folded with their habitual composure in her lap, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond the window, where the last grey light was dying over the darkening lawns. And then, so quietly that Miss Marple had to lean forward to catch the words, she said, "I have waited 20 years for someone to ask me that question properly, Miss Marple. I confess I had begun to think I should go to my own grave before anyone troubled to look closely enough to ask it." She turned then, and the mask that had held so perfectly for 2 decades of service slipped at last, revealing beneath it not the calm devotion the household had so long admired, but a grief so old and so carefully tended that it had calcified, over the slow accumulation of years, into something harder and colder than grief alone, something that might, Miss Marple thought with a chill that reached far deeper than the room's failing warmth, very easily have hardened further still, given sufficient provocation, into an act from which there could be no returning. "You know his real name," Prudence said. "It was not a question. You know what he was, and what he took, and what he was never entitled to call his own." Her voice, when it came again, had dropped to something raw and unguarded, stripped at last of 30 years' careful practice. "What you do not yet know, Miss Marple, is what he did to earn it, and how very long I have carried the knowing of it, quite alone, in a house that never once thought to ask." Chapter 9. What the Orchids Knew. The room had grown darker by degrees while they sat there, the last light failing over the lawns beyond the window, and neither woman had moved to ring for a lamp, as though some unspoken understanding had passed between them that the story about to be told belonged more properly to shadow than to light. Prudence sat with her hands still folded, though the composure that had held them so still for 20 years had become, Miss Marple saw now, not calm, but a kind of exhausted discipline, the last reserves of a woman who had spent her whole life holding a great weight steady and had, at last, set it down. "My brother went to Italy the year I turned 17, Prudence began, her voice low and even, as though she had rehearsed this telling many times in the privacy of her own thoughts, and found, now that the moment had finally come, that the words required no searching. He'd been cheated of Thornfield. Cheated is the only word for it, whatever the lawyers called it at the time. And he went abroad, I think, less to seek his fortune than simply to escape the sight of a house that ought to have been his. He wrote to me faithfully, every month, for the better part of a year. And then the letters stopped." She paused. "My father made inquiries, what few he could afford. We were told, eventually, that Edmund had died of a fever, quite suddenly, in a town outside Florence, and that there was nothing further to be done. My father never recovered from it. He died within 2 years, and the farm went not long after, and I was left, at 19, quite alone in the world with nothing but my brother's letters, and a grief I had nowhere to put." She rose then, moving to the window, her silhouette dark against the last grey light. I went into service because there was nothing else a woman in my position could do with any dignity. I did not come to Thornfield seeking Edmund Rayburn. I want you to understand that, Miss Marple, whatever else you may come to believe of me. I came because the agency sent me, because a place had come open, because I was tired and half-starved, and grateful for a roof. It was only when I saw him, the new master, newly returned from his own years abroad, that I understood. Her voice did not break, but it thinned, stretched taut across some old and terrible recognition. I had spent my childhood in that house, before the ruin. I had played beside my cousin Edmund 100 times as a girl, before he ever went to Italy at all. And the man who stood before me in that hall, claiming his name, claiming his house, I knew within the first moment that I was looking at a stranger. "The scar," Miss Marple said quietly. Prudence nodded, still facing the window. "He had it from a fall as a boy, off the stable roof. I remembered it because I was there when it happened, because I fetched the cloth to stop the bleeding myself. The man in that hall had no mark upon his jaw at all. I told myself at first that I must be mistaken, that grief and hunger had confused my memory, that surely no one would dare such a thing. But I watched him, Miss Marple, for weeks and then months, and every day the certainty grew rather than faded. He did not know the house as my cousin had known it. He mistook rooms. He forgot names that had mattered to my Edmund since childhood. And I understood, at last, that whoever he was, he had not simply taken my brother's name upon his death. He had taken it from him, and I began, very quietly, to believe that he had taken my brother's life as well. "And yet you stayed," Miss Marple said, gently, without accusation. "I stayed because I had nothing else, and because I told myself, for the first several years, that I was gathering proof, a letter, a document, some fragment that would let me go to a magistrate and say, 'Here is the truth, here is what was done to my family.' But there was never proof enough, Miss Marple. He was careful and clever, and the lawyers who had handled the estate were long since dead or paid to forget what they might once have suspected. And so the years passed, and I stayed, and I told myself I stayed for justice, when in truth," her voice caught at last, "the first true crack in 30 years of careful architecture. In truth, I stayed because watching him, serving him, being close enough to hate him properly, was the only way I had left of remaining close to my brother at all." She turned from the window then, and in the near darkness her face was pale and stricken, stripped entirely of the mask Miss Marple had first observed in the Manners Hall 3 days before. 3 months ago he found the photograph. I don't know how. I had kept it hidden so carefully, for so long, but he found it, and he understood at once what I had known all these years, and rather than confess it, rather than face what he had done, he told me he would have me dismissed, discredited, sent away with no character and no recourse, so that if I ever dared speak my brother's name aloud, no one in England would believe a word I said. Her hands, Miss Marple saw, had begun to tremble at last, the discipline of decades finally giving way. I went to him that evening, meaning only to plead with him, to beg him, for my brother's memory, if nothing else, not to erase the last thread connecting my family to the world entirely. I did not go meaning to." She stopped. And in the gathering darkness of the small sitting room, with the last grey light dying beyond the glass, Miss Marple asked, very quietly, the question she had carried with her since the moment she first read 3 scorched words upon a fragment of burnt paper. "What happened in the conservatory, Miss Allerton? I think it is time, at last, that you told me everything." Chapter 10. The Quiet After the Storm. Prudence Allerton did not sit again. She stood by the window a moment longer, as though gathering from the darkening garden itself the courage for what remained to be said, and when at last she spoke, her voice had settled into something quieter than confession, and closer, Miss Marple thought, to relief. "I went to him at 8:30, she said. He was already in the conservatory among his orchids. as he always was at that hour, though he had gone early that evening. I think because he knew I meant to come, and because even a man such as he could not quite bring himself to wait calmly for what he suspected was coming. I asked him, one last time, to tell me the truth. Not to a magistrate, not to the world, only to me. I asked him to say my brother's name aloud, just once, and to tell me how he had died, so that I might at least bury my grief properly, instead of carrying it about unburied for 30 years. Her hands twisted together, the first wholly unguarded gesture Miss Marple had seen from her. He laughed at me, Miss Marple. That is the part I have never been able to forgive, not the years of silence, not even the theft of my brother's name, but that he laughed and told me that Edmund Allerton had died of a fever in Florence, exactly as the world believed, and that I was a foolish, grief-mad woman clinging to a resemblance that existed nowhere but in my own starved imagination. But you did not believe him. I had never believed him, but something in the way he said it, some flicker beneath the contempt, told me, for the first time in 30 years, that he was afraid, truly afraid, not of exposure, but of the truth itself, of having to hear it spoken aloud, in his own voice, after so long spent burying it. And I understood all at once that he had not merely stolen my brother's name from a dead man, he had made him dead. Her voice dropped further still. I do not know, even now, exactly how the shears came to be in my hand. I remember reaching for them. They were lying on the potting bench, where he had left them not an hour before, and I remember him turning from me with that same contemptuous smile, dismissing me as he had dismissed me 100 times before, as though I were nothing, as though my brother had been nothing, as though 30 years of grief could be laughed away in a conservatory full of flowers he loved better than he had ever loved a single living soul. And then it was done, Miss Marple, before I had properly understood that I meant to do it at all. The room had grown almost entirely dark now, and Miss Marple made no move to summon a lamp, sensing that the darkness itself had become, for Prudence, a kind of mercy, a space in which the truth could be spoken without the added cruelty of being seen while speaking it. The gloves were his, Prudence continued, her voice steadying now that the worst of it had been said. I put them on without thinking. Some instinct of self-preservation, I suppose, though I could tell you now that I acted with no plan at all. Only afterward did plan and instinct become impossible to separate. I locked the door from the inside with the second key I have carried on my ring these 20 years, and left by the garden door instead. And I told myself, walking back through the dark, that I had done nothing but what justice itself should have done 30 years before, had anyone troubled to look closely enough to see what I had seen. And the teacup, Miss Marple said gently. You washed it because his hands had touched it that evening, and you could not bear the sight of it standing unwashed, as though nothing at all had changed. Prudence's composure broke at last, not into weeping, but into something quieter and more devastating. A kind of stillness, so complete it seemed to Miss Marple like the stillness of a woman already standing, in her own mind, before whatever judgment awaited her. You understand me better than I have understood myself, these past 3 days, she said. I have asked myself 100 times since that evening whether I am sorry, and I find I cannot answer honestly. I am sorry for the taking of a life. I was raised to believe that a sacred and terrible thing, and I have not stopped believing it, whatever I have done. But I cannot find it in myself to be sorry that the truth is out at last, after 30 years of carrying it quite alone in a house that never once thought to ask why a housekeeper wept behind a locked door in the small hours of the night. Miss Marple sat a long while in silence, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the full and terrible weight of what had been laid before her. Not the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, which she had felt often enough in her long life, but something heavier and sadder. The particular grief of understanding a crime so completely that condemnation and compassion had become, in her own heart, almost impossible to separate. You must tell Inspector Bell what you have told me, she said at last, gently but without equivocation. Not because I doubt the truth of your grief, Miss Allerton, nor even because I doubt that a great injustice was done to your family 30 years ago and left unanswered by a world too indifferent or too easily deceived to look closely enough. But because a life was taken, however great the provocation, and because the truth, the whole truth, not merely the comfortable portion of it, is owed not only to you, but to your brother, whose name deserves to be spoken honestly at last, and to the county, which has lived for 30 years believing a lie it never thought to question. Prudence Allerton did not weep, nor did she protest. She simply nodded, once, in the darkness, and said, "I have been waiting a very long time, Miss Marple, for someone to tell me it was time to stop carrying this alone." Inspector Bell, when the confession was laid before him the following morning, received it with the particular bewilderment of a man who had built his career upon comfortable explanations and found himself, for the first time in some years, confronted with a truth considerably stranger and sadder than any he had imagined. He took Prudence Allerton into custody with a gentleness that surprised even Miss Marple, and it was clear, from the careful, almost apologetic manner of the arrest, that even Bell, a man not given to sentiment, had understood by then that he was not dealing with a murderess in any ordinary sense, but with a woman whom the world itself had wronged long before she had ever raised her hand against another. The formal unravelling took some weeks, conducted with considerably more discretion than the village's appetite for scandal would have preferred. Records were traced, old solicitors' files unearthed, a distant cousin in Italy located and questioned through the diligent correspondence of a country solicitor whom Miss Marple had quietly encouraged in the proper direction. The truth, when it was finally established beyond doubt, confirmed everything Prudence had confessed, and a good deal more besides. The man who had lived 30 years as Edmund Rayburn had been, in fact, a distant connection of the family named Josiah Wren, a fellow traveller who had befriended the true heir in Florence, and, upon his sudden and, it was now strongly suspected, though never conclusively proven, far from natural death, had simply assumed his papers, his letters of introduction, and in time, his very name, judging correctly that a family long estranged from its own disinherited branch would have neither the means nor the inclination to look closely at a returning heir it barely remembered. It was, Miss Marple reflected, turning the matter over in her mind during the long, quiet evenings that followed, a story with no true villain and no true innocent, only a chain of small deceptions and larger silences, stretching back 30 years, each link forged by someone who had believed, in the moment of its forging, that they had no other choice. Josiah Wren had stolen a dead man's name out of poverty and opportunity, and had spent 3 decades imprisoned by his own theft, unable ever to rest easily in the house he had claimed, drawn each evening to his conservatory, not merely from love of orchids, but, Miss Marple suspected, from some unconscious need to tend something honestly in a life built otherwise entirely upon dishonesty. And Prudence Allerton, robbed of her brother and her inheritance and her family's good name in a single stroke, had spent those same 30 years in a servitude that was, in its way, as much a prison as any cell, her grief calcified by silence into something that had, at last, found violent and irrevocable expression. At the trial, held some months later in the county assizes, Prudence Allerton's counsel argued provocation and long-suppressed grief with a persuasiveness that owed a good deal, though he never knew it, to the careful, compassionate account Miss Marple herself had provided of the woman's character and history. The jury, moved by a story that seemed to belong more properly to tragedy than to common criminal proceeding, returned a verdict that spared her the full severity the law might otherwise have demanded, though a life was ended nonetheless, and no verdict, however merciful, could restore either the man who had died among his orchids or the 30 years Prudence Allerton had spent in quiet, unacknowledged mourning. On the last evening of her stay in Larkspur Hollow, Miss Marple walked once more along the eastern road, beneath the ivy-strangled wall of Thornfield Manor, now standing empty and dark, its future uncertain. Its orchids, she had been told, already beginning to wilt for want of the singular, obsessive devotion that had kept them alive. She paused at the gate, as she had paused on her very first evening in the village, and found the conservatory visible still through the gathering dusk, its glass panes catching the last grey light, like something holding its breath. It seemed to her, standing there, that the tragedy of Thornfield Manor was not, in the end, a tragedy of murder at all, but a tragedy of silence, of a young man's death unquestioned, because it was convenient to accept the easier story, of a young woman's grief unspoken, because there was no one in the great houses of England inclined to ask a housekeeper why she wept behind closed doors, of respectability itself, that comfortable English virtue, wielded so often and so carelessly as a shield against the very truths it ought to have illuminated. Josiah Wren had worn respectability like a borrowed coat for 30 years, and it had fooled everyone, herself included, in those first uneasy days of her visit. Everyone except the one person for whom his disguise could never be more than a mask stretched over an old and unhealed wound. Miss Marple turned at last from the gate and walked back toward the village, where lights were beginning to glimmer in cottage windows against the fall of evening, and thought, as she so often thought at the close of such matters, that the solving of a mystery brought with it no true triumph, only the quiet, sorrowful clarity of having looked steadily at something the rest of the world had preferred to leave in shadow. Justice. When it came, so rarely arrived clean or whole, it came instead in fragments, imperfect and costly, salvaged from wreckage that could never be fully repaired. And yet it seemed to her, walking home beneath a sky already thick with stars, that even so partial and painful a justice was worth the seeking, for the alternative, she had seen too clearly in Larkspur Hollow, was a silence that could curdle, given time enough and cruelty enough, into something far worse than the truth, however painful, and that the kindest thing any person could offer another, in the end, was simply the willingness to look closely enough,